Thank you all for joining for our second Digital Tories event at the Conservative Party Conference. My name is Pierre. I'm the co-director of Digital Tories. We're an organisation that seeks to better inform Conservative Party members about some of the big issues happening in the tech policy world. We're here today to talk about defending democracy in the digital age, and I'm really pleased to be joined by some great panellists. We've got Amy Price from Public First, who's here to talk about some research that they've been conducting recently on this very topic. Damian, the Minister for Tech and the Digital Economy. Alex Stepney from News UK, and Poppy Wood from Reset. So Reset is an organisation which seeks to promote digital rights online. So after many years of calls to develop a media policy framework that is fit for the digital age, 2022 has seen numerous media-related bills be announced and potentially go through Parliament. And whilst some of this, this new legislation is broadly welcomed as an upgrade on existing laws, there are major questions about how we can make sure that democratic values are adequately defended online, and how some of these new policies will be enforced, and where there might be gaps in some of the legislation. And so I think today's a good occasion to ask ourselves, what is the extent, to what extent is the trade-off acceptable between protecting the rights of people online and the principle of freedom of speech? Is the gargantuan power of some of the tech giants that we hear about all the time a problem or not? Do they bring sufficient value to the economy and to all of our lives to sort of counterbalance that? How might exemptions for example, journalists and news outlets in the online safety bill be enforced, while some hostile foreign states are currently targeting the UK pretending to be news organisations? And I'd also particularly like to pay tribute, I think, this week to the work of the Molly Rose Foundation and Ian Russell after the verdict was reached this week that social media had been a factor in Molly's death. I think this is all very much front of mind when we were putting together this panel. I think on that note, I'd like to start with, asking a question to Damian, really. The result of the Molly Rose, the inquest into Molly's death, said that social media played a role in her death. What is the government going to do to stop that from ever happening again?
Well, thank you, Pierre, and I think you're right to start with that very important case. And I think a huge credit to the Russell family, who it's been a very difficult period of time over a number of years now, bringing this case to ensure that there was a proper analysis of the lived experience of their daughter through social media, and also to say that the issue is not just what people search for or look for on social media, but what is selected for them. The user experiences, people are effectively data profiled by the platforms and given things to look at that they think will engage them. Because the more engaged you are, the longer you'll stay on the platform, the more often you'll be visited, the more valuable you are as a user. And so I think to say, actually, for some people, if someone is suffering from anxiety, depression, and they engage with content that reflects that, or someone is exposed to content that glamorizes or self-harm and worse, they are more likely to see that. The more vulnerable you are, the more likely you are to be exposed to content that makes your vulnerabilities worse. And that is irresponsible. And the online safety bill is designed to create proactive responsibilities for companies to stop that, to challenge them on the data inputs into their algorithms that mean that a 14-year-old girl engage repeatedly share content that is likely to cause herself. This is irresponsible, and companies have to be accountable to it. When we talk about online safety, it can't just be about media literacy so we understand how to keep ourselves safe online. We're dealing with people who abuse others online and seek to intimidate others online. It's also the liability of the platforms that are creating a user experience which can expose people to this content. And I think that is what I think is the most important about the online safety bill, that responsibility, that proactive responsibility, applying not just to content moderation, but to the systems that drive the sorts of companies who are promoting their content policy.
Okay, and the bill has always, the government's always been quite clear that they want to strike a balance with freedom of speech and with the rights of people to express themselves, and as they should be able to do so in a democracy. I mean, this is something that also the news industry has traditionally thought a lot about, and through years of work around the world has sort of managed to find a balance on. Alex, I wanted to ask you, do you think the bill sufficiently does protect freedom of speech?
Oh gosh, it's such a difficult question to answer fully, and I know there have been a huge number of events actually at the Conservative Party conference that have been seeking to answer that exact question. I can really only speak to it from a news publisher broadcaster perspective, and that is to say that I think when we started looking at this bill, when the white paper process was going through, our initial concern was that the bill was proposing what was essentially a systems and processes approach to content regulation. And that there wasn't really enough discussion within that white paper about freedom of expression, and there wasn't certainly enough discussion about how news publisher content and broadcaster content would be treated within the framework. And we started advocating that there needed to be a recognition of the importance of recognised journalistic sources, recognised journalistic material, and that needs to be protected within the framework. And I think we've now gotten to a place where the government has recognised that, and they've recognised that because there have been a number of incidents that have been quite well publicised of censorship by platforms of journalistic material, and we've seen some really good steps to try and create a framework that means that content can't just be indiscriminately removed. Now, I don't necessarily think it goes as far as we would have originally liked. We would have liked for our content not to be touched at all. But where we've gotten to is a system where there will be a must-carry obligation on the platforms to content which is disputed. So they can't make the decision to just arbitrarily remove something, but instead they will have to engage with the news publisher, with the broadcaster, to explain why they have an issue with the content, and then there will be an appeals process that is run. Ultimately though, the platform will still be the arbiter. There isn't a backstop, a court for someone to go to, but it is a much better system than we currently have. So in that sense, I think it's freedom of expression enhancing, but there are still some other questions I have around the kind of point around algorithmic profiling, algorithmic amplification, how that is going to account for news journalism, which I don't think has really been a focus of discussion. It's something we can probably come back to later.
Yeah, no. Amy, you've just conducted quite I think this is an exclusive for our panel, you've just conducted quite an extensive piece of research on these very questions. Would you be able to share with us a few words on what your respondents have been saying on the balance to find?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Amy Price, and I'm Associate Director in a company called Public First, which has a lot of public opinion, both through polling and focus groups and a variety of other research methods. And in recent weeks we have been running some focus groups in particular, asking thematic questions to members of the public that kind of correlate with some of the themes we're discussing here. So to be clear, we haven't handed them a copy of the bill and said, what do you think? But we have been asking them how they feel about freedom of expression and how they feel that should be balanced in an online world. And what I say is very much context rather than kind of being delivered with a point in mind. But I think overridingly, the public perception of the internet and the public experience of the internet is a positive one. And we obviously hear of really extraordinary, or perhaps not as extraordinary as we like, cases where it veers into the more harmful territory. But I think if this week has shown us anything about policy making, is that you can't make policy in a vacuum. You have to make sure that you're kind of communicating your policies and communicating the rationale behind your policies to the people as you implement them. And I think that's very, very true as we go about regulating the online space and potentially implementing frictions for how people are using that currently from open platform. And as I say, when we asked people how they felt about the internet, the instinct was to say that it made their lives easier, it made democracy easier to access, and it gave them platforms to express their opinions. And when they were asked about freedom of expression, universally the people we talked to said that freedom of expression was a good thing. And they said, I think think one of the more memorable quotes we had from an NHS worker in London was, "When you lose your opinion, what else have you got left?" When we then pushed those focus groups to think about harm, they all recognised the instances as that being discussed by the courts in the last week, particularly regarding children, particularly problematic. And again, there was a kind of consensus that we should be protecting vulnerable people, particularly youngsters online. So again, public consensus is there. Where it breaks down, and this is the kind of nub of the issue for all of us on this panel and beyond, is how you go about doing that. Because half the people we talk to would say, actually, yeah, there's a point at which freedom of expression becomes harmful and maybe it's not such a good thing. And then there's half a group saying, no, even if an opinion is unpalatable or dangerous, they should be allowed to express that opinion. And then the other kind of crux of the matter was who polices it. Because there was consensus around what we might call cancel culture, although not everyone would use that term, that lots of people self-police online just as they do in real life. They're aware of what their peers think, aware of how their peers might respond to them, and therefore they self-censor, and particularly around political opinions. And this might speak to some people in the room, but quite a few of the people we talk to identify as Conservative voters, but wouldn't put that on Twitter, wouldn't share that on Twitter because of the vitriol they might receive. And the ultimate scepticism of all of this, when policing what is harmful and what is appropriate freedom of expression, was that there was a huge amount of scepticism around the involvement of big tech platforms making those subjective decisions, and also politicians making those decisions as well. And all of that is to say, and I'll kind of draw it to a close for now, that public opinion must be at the heart of every step of this journey, because the public has to understand what the government is doing. There has to be a degree of trust there. And if I may, I'll now quote some numbers at you, which I've been resisting doing because I know it causes a slight glaze over. But surprisingly, I thought fewer than 5% of young people actually feel unsafe online. So actually our young people, when we ask them, and this is self-reported, say that they feel confident in being able to navigate online spaces safely. And actually 80% of them said, yeah, I know how to navigate this online world. 20% saying they don't is still a huge proportion of the population, and certainly if those are vulnerable people, then we need to tackle that. But ultimately, actually, who is the victim, so to speak, is also something that we should address today, and I think we'll cover under the misinformation piece. The conversations we were having have to some extent moved on from the themes of violence or pornography, and actually young people were highly aware of misinformation and the vulnerabilities that lie in the older generations. So just as parents were worried about their children, children were worried about their parents. And so again, there's another dimension to this kind of idea of harm. Yes, it's absolutely exposure to dangerous and violent things, but it's also the vulnerability that comes with online scams, of misinformation, say of anti-vax mentality would be something that I would personally pick up on. So that's all a big information dump of the conversations we've been having. I'm very lucky in my job, I just get to ask the questions, and there are others who have the ultimate responsibility of answering them. But yeah, I think that's my kind of start at the 10, is that public opinion, public understanding of why there is regulation has to be a part of it, and we cannot divorce that policy making or even that implementation of policy from public consciousness.
Thank you, Amy. I'm sure other panelists will want to pick up on that one a bit later, but I also just wanted to remind maybe the audience that, or let you know, this year's theme for World Press Freedom Day was journalism under digital siege, and Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, who are two journalists, one from the Philippines, one from Russia, both won won last year's Nobel Peace Prize for their work and for the fact that they've constantly over the last few years been harassed online and threatened by their own governments. How can, I wanted to ask Poppy, because at Reset you do a lot of work around the world and sometimes supporting people in their situations. What can we do to make sure that people like journalists, but also people like activists, or people who are trying to speak truth to power, prevent them from being spied on, but then also prevent them from being harassed for just doing their jobs?
Yeah, no, there's a really big issue we see in politics as much as we do in journalism. People in public life putting themselves forward at great personal cost, sometimes to personal safety, and you see seen politicians and journalists be attacked and murdered because of their views and their commitment to public life, and that's obviously horrendous and something that we should not be accepting in our society. That what is always shocking is how quickly, when you see the coverage of this, they say, and we've been looking at the perpetrator's social media accounts, and it turns out they've been kind of following radicalised views online, etc. And we saw this with David, we saw this with Joe Cox, and then some of the work that Maria Ressa and Pierre have been talking about is the role of the platform in really polarising society, driving people to the extremes really, really quickly, and the people in public life being kind of front and centre of that. And I think, these are, as we were hearing, these are not easy issues to solve with a blunt instrument. It would be wonderful if we had an online safety bill that just solved all our problems and it was 10 pages long and we were all done. These are really, really complicated issues, and that's why we have to take time to think about them and get them right. And they're not always right in every country. It's not a cookie cutter approach. Plus, it's different for different parts of society. So when we talk about journalism, there's protections in this bill for journalists as separate to the news media, recognising the role of journalists and putting themselves forward in public life. And I think that, and then there's an extension of for those kind of protections for content and democratic importance, which I expect will apply to politicians and people engaging in political speech, to recognise the role that politicians have in sharing information. And also, lots of people will say, well, hold on a second, but lots of politicians say nonsense. No politicians in this room, but let's talk about politicians around the world. Should they be allowed to have that kind of freedom? And I actually think there's an argument to say, well, we should know if our politicians are racist. We should know if they're pushing out anti-vax conspiracy theories, and people don't like that. But there are interventions that platforms can make on labelling, etc., to say, you should think about this post. So it's not, there's no kind of silver bullet for this stuff. I think what we need to do is recognise the vulnerability of people who put themselves forward in public life. I think we need to, on things like journalists and news media, be careful about how much we extend the definition of those groups to include everyone. So what we have in the online safety bill is a definition of news media that I would say is probably broad enough to include the likes of Russia Today, etc. And as Alex was talking about, that might mean that if media content is posted online, platforms and publishers have to talk to each other before there's any kind of intervention by the platform. Absolutely appropriate for that to be applied to traditional news media, should that sort of application happen to platforms like Russia Today. And those are really difficult issues to get our heads around and to define, because we don't have a tradition of defining what a news journalist is here in the UK. So I think lots of thought has to go into this, and there has been plenty of thought going into the online safety bill and other interventions. Protections for people who put themselves forward in public life are really, really important online, just in the same way that we provide those kind of security protections for people offline. But we need to make sure that when we do put these into legislation, that we're careful about not putting in such a kind of sweeping protection that you're protecting everyone, because that diminishes the power and the importance of the protections in the first place for a very select group of people who have made those kind of public commitments.
Thank you. I mean, on that note, the ability to trust the news that you read and watch is, fundamental to a healthy democracy. And in a world where we're increasingly finding this news online, we have, rediscovered the age-old sort of disinformation. And Damian, the war in Ukraine has shown in particular how insidious this can be, and how in particular, Russian propaganda reaches our shores via the internet. How can that be countered, do you think?
Well, the government is considering to the national security bill. So if you have recognised networks of disinformation from a hostile foreign state, where effectively the disinformation is being used as a weapon of war, and that would where that qualified an intervention under the national security bill, that would also apply the online safety bill as well. So if you had, and that would be less about individual hosting, but so if there's a network of accounts that will be controlled by the Russian military and being used to spread disinformation, then the national security bill would require those platforms to intervene to remove those accounts. This sort of happens informally in the background quite a lot. Again, you're not talking about moderation of speech here, it's more of the recognition of a network of accounts that are actually in a coordinated way and being weaponized by a hostile state. So you can start to look at things like that. As I said, informally, the platforms do scan for that as well. But I think you do see a problem in general with disinformation. That in some ways you could say the real threat to freedom of speech on the internet at the moment is less content moderation on the platforms. It's more the massive abuse people get when they speak their minds. That intimidates people from not wanting to take part in online debate. As Maria Ressa would say, the massive drowning out of alternative opinions people disagree with, because by networks and accounts coordinated to try and dampen and suppress dissenting voices so that no one really sees them. And the effect of echo chambers, which mean that people don't really get a plurality of opinions. If they get their news from social media, they largely have their opinions reinforced by people they already engage with. And that can also have a radicalising effect on people's opinions as well. I remember you've heard me quoted lots of times the report on Facebook that showed that in Germany 60% of people that joined Facebook groups and shared extremist content did so with the active promotion of the platform itself. So I think you've got to say that if there's a question about how does freedom of speech exist and thrive in a world of online disinformation, we have to look at these system effects that really both intimidate people from speaking out and drown out their voice when they do, and leave people in a position where they're not exposed to a breadth of opinion. And the editor is not the editor of a newspaper or the editor of a news programme, the editor of an algorithm, which is data profiled them and is making those choices on their behalf without any real input from them on how it's being made.
Okay. I mean, Amy, do you think does that sort of chime with what respondents were saying on how much they trust things or not, or?
I think yes and no is the unhelpful answer. Is that I think taking first the misinformation voice, and I appreciate the point that media literacy isn't the only answer, but it is one of the very important answers. Because I thought it was remarkable when we polled young people that 58% of them said that they hadn't had a conversation at home about spam and deceptive practices, and 49%, so half, hadn't had a conversation at home about misinformation. So I think there is a key piece here that people aren't cultivating necessarily those skills in a structured or rigorous or consistent way across the piece that I think is a really important part of this. I think when it comes to finding new news sources, there's conflicting evidence on this, because there is absolutely evidence about the consolidation due to algorithms, etc., of news sources online. But social media platforms also are shown to help people diversify their news sources. Anecdotally, this morning I read an article in the Irish Times because it popped up on my Instagram. Now, I don't mean to be flippant, but again, you have to hold in balance the normal experience and then the unfortunate, but experiences of an important minority, perhaps. And so I think very much when talking to people, their immediate lived experience doesn't always correspond with the conversations we have in forums like this, because they don't see the immediate harm that they're being exposed to. I do also think, and this is a conversation that we have here and elsewhere, that it's unpinning and unpacking what happens online that doesn't happen in the real world, and actually what is part of human experience and has been for a long time. So if you talk in the HE sector, they talk about cancel culture in the context of no platforming speakers in a very physical, present way. And actually, as the Minister's kind of mentioned and alluded to, we now have a slightly more extreme version of that online on Twitter. And at what point do we intervene solely in the digital world versus how do we come up with a holistic policy that approaches all kinds of cancel culture from the angles? That's a very long way of saying that the public are conflicted on this when you talk to them, and quite often you'll ask them a straightforward question and they'll give you one answer, and when you start unpacking down to how do you actually want to do that in practice, that then begins to evolve. But I think fundamentally, media literacy has a part to play, and then we also need to be really careful that we are recognising where the online world is different, and actually where the online is an extension of the real world and problems we've been facing for decades.
Thank you. I mean, I just want to put a bit of that, I guess, to Alex as well, in the sense that the challenge, it does seem sometimes like the challenge is a bit on the news industry to respond to ways in which consumer, the way especially younger people consume news has changed. What work is the new, or what work, for example, do your publications do to try and meet those new ways of consuming news?
Sure, yeah. So I think I'm really privileged to work in a very innovative, very exciting business that is embracing digital and embracing different forms of engaging with its users. So I'd say we're potentially at the vanguard even of digital. So it's a very, very exciting place to be. And so newsrooms are always trying and testing and seeing what new platforms they should be on, where they should be engaging with audiences that are younger, older, from different demographics across the UK. So there's some, for example, looking at TikTok, Facebook is also one that gets used often as well, and actually creating content in different ways as well. So we have we're a broadcaster, we're a news publisher, we're an audio business, but actually increasingly we've got Times Radio, which is bringing to life
Yeah.
the actual
A massive
news
success.
and a huge
Yeah.
success, and that also spins off podcasts. We've got Talk TV, which originated out of the radio stations, radio. So really trying to get to different audiences in different ways through wherever the audience is, that's where we need to go, and that's where we need to brands. And which makes it very exciting, really interesting. But we do come across a whole series of challenges from being these digital innovators, these digital pioneers. One of the challenges that I think is really growing for us is around the distribution of our content and where we see some quite perverse activities that change how journalism is distributed. So one of those examples is, for example, on Facebook. Facebook, I think, is pretty synonymous with people getting news via the newsfeed. But over the last year or so, we've seen really big dips and changes in how much news content actually is amplified to audiences. So on any given week, we can see high audiences and then low audiences, and there's no rhyme or reason as to why Facebook has decided to change algorithms that change that distribution. And similarly, we're seeing a trend towards softer types of content doing very well. So lifestyle journalism, how many ways to fold your shirt tomorrow, that will do very well, as opposed to the kind of harder news. And I think that actually raises in itself some really important questions about, how do we engage different audiences with actually the kinds of content that they need to be getting. There's no longer, for particularly younger audiences, they're no longer sitting down with a newspaper and getting the serendipitous moment of coming across different types of stories that they wouldn't necessarily have wanted to touch on in the past. People are much more going into the story or seeing it in the newsfeed and then not necessarily picking through and getting that kind of extra content. So I think there are some real quite complicated challenges that exist when platforms intermediate.
On that point, Damian, so traditionally in the broadcasting space in the UK, broadcasters are challenged by regulation to promote alternative views and to confront different opinions, and that's also what the news industry does in general. I know that there was the idea of a media bill that would potentially bring some of the streaming platforms in line with that as well. Is that something that's still going ahead? Will that have anything to do with would these? I think it was called the video on demand broadcasting code.
Yeah.
Is that still being considered?
Yeah, there are. So there's two elements to that. One is, to what extent should big video on demand platforms be sit under the broadcasting code, for want of a better word. And I think there's a case for that. I think if they're reaching big audiences, and effectively, if you're watching YouTube on a smart device, that your favourite YouTuber is just as much television as BBC One is. For some people, far more likely to be watching YouTube now BBC One. And you look at the Ofcom Media Nations report, and you look at the viewing figures also for young people, say under 40s, and it seems to be a permanent shift to really people watching what they want to watch wherever it is, and they might find podcast more rewarding than Panorama if it's something they're interested in, and that's the choice they're making. That's great. What I don't think we can do though is say within that environment, say we start regulating news providers as if they were the BBC, because I think the public service broadcasters' requirements to show balance. I think everyone will probably say that some of those companies interpret those rules in different ways. Not all news programs are the same in the way they view the world, but nevertheless there are those Ofcom requirements.